Data from ENACT Africa shows that no inroads are being made in the fight against organized crime, especially on the continent of Africa. The group saying this kind of crime affects governance in many countries. In South Africa, for example, we have seen this play out through the construction mafia, halting projects in provinces such as KwaZulu-Natal, among other examples. Let's include the devastation that came with state capture. Joining us now to analyze the real impact of organized crime in South Africa, particularly when it comes to governance, is Dr. Crispian Olver, who is the author of the book, How to Steal a City, The Battle of Nelson Mandela Bay. Doctor, thank you very much for your time. I hope I pronounced your surname correctly there. Can we start with this question, which describes what organized crime is?
Good morning. Thank you for having me on the show. And it's a really pertinent topic that we're addressing. So look, organized crime is a level of criminal organization that is basically a syndicate, and we've seen it mushroom in South Africa over the last 15 years. We spent the first 10 years of our democracy in a sort of blissful state of believing that we were exceptional as a developing country and that we wouldn't face the kinds of corruption and organized crime challenges that we have. And now we're really dealing with what was a little bit of a blind spot in our early democracy.
Yeah.
And we've seen this infiltrate into the state. So, there's organized crime that operates as syndicates in the wider economy. But it infiltrates the state in many ways, and it does it through political interference and politicians trying to extract rents out of the state. We also see it at an official level. So, we've seen it become very widespread in areas such as traffic enforcement, home affairs officials, many areas where the state is allocating services or doing crucial regulatory functions. Officials get bribed to basically give private actors a leg up.
Wow. So I want to focus the attention on exactly what you have just said. Politicians trying to extract rent from the state. Because in the book that you have written, The Battle for Nelson Mandela Bay, you write about criminal cliques that existed which hampered the work of government. Do you believe that these are still prevalent in South African municipalities?
They're very widespread. That's the short answer to your question. And what struck me in studying Nelson Mandela Bay was the way, some of these operations are really very sophisticated, and the prime movers in the operations are not often the politicians. They're well-organized criminal syndicates that spot the opportunity in the state, and then they set out deliberately to manipulate all of the levers of decision-making and control to secure a particular decision. And we saw that on a grand scale with state capture in the state-owned enterprises and the Gupta family. But what I was documenting with the book is a far more decentralized form, where this is taking place in, almost every local government around the country. And there are various incentives. I know we all like to blame the politicians for a lot of what's been happening. The other blind spot, I mean, we spent the first 15, almost 20 years of this democracy without any regulations on party political funding. So parties could go out and raise money from whoever under any circumstances, and it could be in cash or in kind. There were no limits on it. There were no limits on external funding, and there was no obligation to report. So it became a little bit of a free-for-all. And, you know, I know people like to point fingers at the ANC as being, you know, highly corrupt. But in fact, in my experience, every party extracts rents out of the local economy in one form or another. Some are very deleterious, and they're what I would characterize as extractive relationships that basically turn the local economy into a downward spiral. Others are a little bit more growth-oriented, and there's still, you know, private enterprises funding parties, but they do it in collaboration around growth coalitions. So rents themselves, you know, all parties live off rents. But it's the nature of the rent extraction process that I think determines whether you see local development or local decay.
Yeah, I think you've gone some detail there, Doctor, talking about how these criminals work, particularly in local spheres of government. But I'd like you to answer the question about how they assert their power.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, money is the great oiler of the wheels of the machinery. But I discovered a range of tactics, and they included, for instance, orchestrated protests. And it took me a long while to cotton on, for instance, to what was happening in Nelson Mandela Bay. There were these organized housing and land protests all around the Bay that were actually instigated by developers trying to create a sense of urgency around the housing crisis. And, you know, I'm not, there were legitimate housing grievances, but these grievances were being manipulated and then protests organized, which forced the municipality to urgently procure land in particular areas. And when I dug into it, there was always a corrupt deal sitting behind it.
Wow.
So, you know, these syndicates, you know, political economic coalitions, can we call them, cabals that infiltrate the local state, use a repertoire which includes protest, it includes violence and intimidation, and it includes large amounts of money. And, you know, there was, you know, the steady flow of millions of rands each month out of the municipal coffers into the hands of various players.
We're going to complete the conversation with what you raised a little earlier about political party funding, the act that did not exist for some time, and what impact that has had. But talk to us about whether you think whistleblowers have a role to play in exposing these cabals, as you describe them, and if so, how do you protect them in the process? Because they, in turn, have become very vulnerable, as we have observed in recent times.
Completely. You know, first of all, whistleblowers are integral to exposing this kind of corruption. I would never have made any progress in Gqeberha if I didn't have a network of people that were willing to take at extreme personal risk, come and report to me and to the people that were investigating these things, give us the information about what was actually going on. So these people, whistleblowers, are the bedrock of a proper response to corruption and organized crime. The current system gives them very little protection. I mean, I would protect their anonymity for as long as possible, but, ultimately these cases have got to go to court and people need to give evidence. So it's very difficult to, completely protect people's identities once legal processes begin.
Yeah.
But on the whole, we don't have a legal system that properly protects whistleblowers. I think it's an area where we really need much stronger legislation and much stronger administrative procedures.
Let's conclude then the conversation about political party funding that you said did not exist for a good decade and a half. And now that it has been introduced, there is this call that it needs more teeth. That's especially what the IEC is saying. But how vulnerable have we been, and what kind of influences have we seen as a result of that legislation not having existed? And do you believe, by the way, that it's got to be done away with, as some political parties are starting to complain?
Yeah. Look, I think all of the parties in Parliament don't like the Party Political Funding Act, because it forces a level of transparency onto them which they haven't been used to. And I think I'm correct in saying all the parties are complaining that it's led to a decline in funding to political parties, which certainly needs to be looked at. Although on the face of it, I don't see why. Many businesses contribute to all of the parties in proportion to the share of the vote that they have in Parliament. And I don't see why they now should be anxious about declaring that. That's a contribution to building democracy.
Yeah.
There is an argument to be made that the state itself should be stepping in and providing a minimum level of funding to parties. I think if it could stop the corruption that we're seeing today, that would be probably a measure that would bring returns many times over what it will cost the state. I think we've got to stay the course. We're trying to close the stable door after the horse has bolted. I still think the legislative measures that are in the Act are good, and I would be very sad to see them watered down. I don't think that's the correct direction to be moving in. And I'd, encourage another look at, is there a basis for the state coming to the party and providing a certain minimum level of funding to political parties?
Dr. Crispian Olver, let me thank you very much for your time. And he is a researcher on organized crime and its impact, particularly as it relates to governance. And we've seen that play out in the South African state. Wreaking havoc. Thank you very much. He is also the author of the book called How to Steal a City, The Battle for Nelson Mandela Bay.